Good evening. I have a couple of things that I'd like to say, and I'm going to start in one place and I'm going to land somewhere else, right? But it's all linked, and hopefully I can draw that string through it, or draw that thread through it for you and for myself, right? As I think out loud. So, in most, if we, in most instances, and if we take our own lives as one instance in the broader spectrum of community, family, human life, the universe, we understand implicitly that, and intuitively, right, and empirically, that time keeps going. And as we move through time, or as time moves through us, whichever way you want to characterize it, change tends to follow, right? Some people embrace that change and understand it, and they don't fear it. Maybe it excites them. For others, that change does scare them and terrify them, and so they wish to plant the flag at a certain stage of development or at a certain stage of growth and remain there, right? I have my views, and I'm accepting of them, and that's it. And we understand this, right? And there's a kind of, not necessarily a negative nod to this per se, right? But certainly a recognition of that stuckness or that stayingness that people tend to have, right? And we characterize that, or we characterize a person like that as being stuck in their ways, right? Someone that just refuses to move, even when the impetus is there for movement to be the most profitable and the most beneficial action to take. Someone who resists that, when for all intents and purposes it is the most obvious thing to do, is to move with the times, right? To not be stuck, a stick in the mud, right? That person said to be stuck in their ways, right? They've refused the influence of time and life on them and remain stuck at a certain point and have not changed or developed across the whatever period of time it is, okay? And if we pull the scope out then from an individual life to, say, generational change or periods of generational time, we understand that time also has that effect on generations. And we tend to characterize certain periods of time, right? Like the 90s, or we might have had uh, the rock people, right? The punks, the hippie movement, right? If we think globally, we characterize certain periods by the most pronounced expression of a tendency of that time in the people. Whether it's artificially created or co-opted is a conversation for a different day, right? But the recognition and the reality of different forms of expression of human experience are certainly evident enough for us to be able to pinpoint them to certain instances, right? If you take certain types of music, a certain type of dress, and a certain way of speaking, certain slang, and you roll that in a ball and present it to somebody, more than likely people will be able to direct you to what period of time in the last few generations that style or that type comes from. So with that being said, and with a blatant understanding and a blatant observation of the reality of change in people, in our tendencies, sometimes we're more adventurous, other times we're more frugal or conservative in our tendencies, in our morality, in types of behavior and expression that we will condemn, and other times types of behavior and expression that we will promote and accept, right? Kind of like that. like a bellows, right? We expand and we contract like breathing, in and out, right? There's an active and a passive, an expansive and a restrictive sort of movement across the time that you can see. And over the course of your life, you can even see this in yourself, right? And you can see it in our cultural history and our racial history. If you want to split the difference, you can. If you don't, that's fine. And then you can see it globally too, right? With different areas and different races expressing different tendencies at different times. But flux and change is the name of the game, right? The whole idea that you can't step in the same river twice. Constant movement, constant dance between a person and the external world or society. There's a molding and a shaping that goes on there. But yet, when we think of the big questions, right? So what is the origin of it all? We tend to think of Big Bang Theory, something like that, theory, or we think of God, right? We think of religion. And that's nearly always been the domain of theology or religion. But yet, we have adopted and lived through and lived with a religion that is loosely enough anyway, right? Because even inside of the Christian religion, it has morphed and changed over time, right? But core tenets of it haven't, right? The fundamentals of Christianity have remained the same, have remained static enough for long stretches of time, which kind of fly in the face of observation of ourselves, of other people, of fashions, trends, types. Even philosophies take on a certain flavour of the generation, right? Nearly all human endeavours do. There's a movement, because each, as one comes to the pinnacle of expression, its opposite, right? Its antagonist bounces off it, and then it causes a disintegration in popularity, and it molds and changes and adapts, right? And people, we change it. It changes with us. It changes for us or in us, whatever way you want to look at it, right? But when we think of religion, we're still kind of wedded to the idea that either change stops there, or there are certain parts of the universe that don't follow that rule, if you want to call it that, that change is inevitable and change is ongoing. We accept that, or we accept that there are final answers that we have acquired, and we have called it Christianity. And these questions need not be asked anymore, because we have landed on the finish line of these questions, which means we no longer need to think of these things, which would imply a certain level of the highest pinnacle of human achievement you can in terms of theological thinking, right? Thinking. We have reached the pinnacle. We have achieved an element of perfection in one aspect of human experience. Okay, so where is the perfect society then that follows this perfection in thinking, this absolute masterful achievement that we have taken over the last 1500 years, 16, whatever you want to call it? Where is it, right? Surely, if we have achieved perfection in our understanding of the biggest questions, the source of it all, how we should be, what our relationship is to our beginnings, to our future, to our death, to our afterlife, you would imagine then that some of that perfection would have been expressed in other areas of human experience. I'm not seeing that. You don't see that, right? You don't see that. We've remained stagnant in that domain of life, in that arena, right? We've remained stagnant, and we've dug our heels in, and we have declared that these questions need no longer be answered or asked even, right? Because we've got there already. Or we go the opposite and say, well, there's no point in asking that, 'cause there's no such thing. Okay? So you have the atheist and you have the fundamentalist, the dogmatist. And what's interesting about the dogmatist is that Christianity, Judaism, Islam, And these monolithic religions, right, they are the final word. They all claim to be the final word, right? And there need not be any speculation beyond that, because we've got that. What they all have in common is that they worship a God that is transcendent. What does that mean? It means a God that is external to our world, to the creation itself. The claim is that God has created the universe, but he stands apart from the universe, right? Like someone building a bit of origami. You have created the animal shape with the paper, but you stand apart from that. So while the creation comes from you, you are greater than and beyond the creation, right? So to understand the creation in totality or even in parts, it doesn't really give you a total explanation of the creator, okay? And these Abrahamic faiths, they adore and worship the creator itself, totally, in my case, in my view, to the detriment of the creation, okay? God is beyond us. We can't possibly know him. And what came before that was a view that the gods walk amongst us, right? And we had different gods. We weren't bound to one God. We had gods of war, we had gods of divination, we had gods of poetry, we had gods of deception, right? We had gods of the tribe, we had gods of the river, gods of fire, gods of technology, gods of smithwork, gods of medicine, gods of healing, right? We had the most perfected symbol we could imagine when we think of certain psychological or human traits that we engaged in. We had a God for it all, right? So we held it in such esteem. We held nearly all characteristics and traits and tendencies of human beings on a par with each other. So not one came to dominate, right? You had the part of being a man then and being a human being was to find balance and equilibrium in your own heart and mind amongst all of these tendencies. Not disqualifying any one, but recognizing that there is a devil and a God in each of us, if you want to use Christian terminology, right? Or there's a Set and an Osiris in all of us, right? There's a Brez, a Bray, and a Lu in all of us. We have all of those tendencies, right? We have the Morrigan in Irish mythology, right? The harbinger of death, right? Who personified or symbolically represented with the crow, right? The bringer of death, the crow that perched on the shoulder of Cuchulainn, indicating that death was near. Okay, we also have Danu, the goddess of fertility, Bridget, the goddess of fertility, bringing things forth into creation, right? We have it in all of us. What's my point? My point is that if you accept the idea that we have discovered God, we understand and believe God to be separate from creation, he is above and beyond what we can ever articulate or conceptualize, and realistically, he's got very little to do or very little interest in his creation, then we betray ourselves, because there's so much of our life as the creation that we just no longer have an interest in. And the same thing applies. You need not be religious to follow this, right? Because the same thing applies in terms of physics and science, bro, right? Where they're looking for the same thing. What is the source or the root of it all? And they come up with their own theories, right? But by constantly looking outward, we are rejecting and denying exploration of things that are fundamentally part of ourselves, which are these different human tendencies. And one of those human tendencies that has long been rejected and denied and demonized, if you will, particularly from a Christian perspective or in a Christian perspective, in the Christian theology itself, is anger, pride. Why these things would be demonized is beyond me, right? Because Every trait in a human being is part of all of us. We can all be envious, we can all be jealous, we can all be irrational, we can all be anger, full of rage, we can be blubbering, whinging messes, given the right context and the right time, right? We can all be all of those things at any given time. So why would we deny them things to ourselves or demonize them to the point where it's nearly seen as reprehensible to be embodying any of these things, right? And anger is one that has been kicked into the gutter and spat on for a very long period of time. And not only anger, but what anger is the surface level representation of, which is a desire to not accept the status quo. You become angry when what is going on around you is in direct conflict with what you want and who you are, your own values. That's when anger comes to the front. When something external to yourself is inflicting onto you circumstances that you do not wish to have. And anger can also be turned inwards and come from inwards as well. When you're creating your own circumstances that you don't like, you keep making mistakes that you promised you wouldn't anymore. You can become angry with yourself, but the same principle applies, right? Anger begs for change. It demands change of you. It demands action aimed at changing the status quo, making something better for yourself, right? Ameliorating the suffering that's going on because of the state that you're in. Anger is the key that opens the door to change. Without anger, you cannot change anything because you're not moved to change it, because you're not angry. Which means, and if you're not angry and you're not moved to change anything, you are accepting of the status quo. Or you can spend your time pretending that you're not accepting it, and you can spend your time complaining about it. But either way, you remain static, right? Stationary. You remain stuck. And a part of that anger, if we're to accept what I'm saying here, anger being the doorway towards change, the motivator towards change of unacceptable circumstances to circumstances that are better and beneficial for yourself. In order to do that and act on the world in that way, you need to put yourself center stage and into the limelight, where people are going to watch. As soon as you stick your head out in Ireland as an example, human traits, they're nearly universalized, right? Except in cultures where you have a conformity as held as the highest of morality. And I'd still even question that, right, whether that's legitimate or not. But as soon as you decide to work on your anger or to work with your anger and to move to effect change in your life that's more beneficial for you as an individual, right, based on your own nature, morality and values, you are highlighting yourself and putting a bullseye on your back, because you're telling everybody, I refuse to accept and go along with what you've accepted and with what you have chosen to continuously go along with. But people don't like that, right? Why? Because there's an innate desire in all of us to stand for ourselves, to take responsibility for ourselves, to develop our own morality, and to chart our own direction and our own course in life. But that means standing up for yourself. And that means drawing the ire and the scorn of people. And that might even mean people attacking you. And you can retreat at that point, or you can develop a relationship with defensive force, violence, if you want to call it that. You can develop a relationship with these sort of martial tendencies, defensive tendencies, right? Volitional and assertive tendencies to, in the face of overwhelming odds at times, or in the face of strict opposition, you are still willing to persevere. This is what mythologies are for. This is what stories are for, right? This is what wrestling, professional wrestling, used to be great at. Telling the story of the underdog, battling against, right, the Cyclops, the giant, the enemy, right, the tyrant, to overcome, so that they could retain who they were as an individual, and they could speak their intention into the world and back that intention with action, right? So what we're looking at in much of the Western world, and I'll speak of Ireland because that's where I'm from and that's what I look at the most, you have a massive amount of people, for whatever reasons. We can go into the reasons on another day, but you have a massive amount of people who refuse to stand up for themselves because they recognize that if they decide to stand up and out away from the crowd and against something that is foisting on them circumstances that do not make them happy and may lead them to anger, if they express that anger and stand up for themselves, that they could be crushed by a force external to them. So they withdraw into themselves. They deny their own anger to themselves, and they do as Nietzsche said, which was, human beings, we tend to turn our vices into virtues, right? So the worst parts of ourselves, we tend to varnish it pristine and varnish it gold, and we sell it then as something nice, right? So the coward will say, I'm not a coward, I'm not afraid of conflict or any of that sort of stuff, I'm just a pacifist, right? It's a virtue that I have. That's why I won't stand up for myself. I won't stand against anything because I don't believe in it. I'm a pacifist. Yeah, right. What? Right. So, by denying our own anger and refusing to stand up for ourselves, we put ourselves in a position where we draw onto ourselves continuously circumstances created and manufactured by other people that are not in our benefit. And we sit there and we take it because we refuse to get angry, because we refuse to believe in ourselves enough to stand up and apart from other people. But what does that do? It continuously encroaches on our freedom, and it limits our ability to make choices that can keep us in a position where we don't have to act out from anger and with anger. Right? So inevitably, it puts us in a position where the last remaining choice we will have is to get angry and to stand up for ourselves and to express our desire in the world and implement our action on the world in a way that fights for change, a change in the circumstances that are constantly funneling us into a corner and will leave us with no other choice but to express that human tendency and feeling of anger, the very thing that we denied ourselves for so long, but the very thing that has ended up with us, by denying it, being boxed into a corner where the only key left to us is to embody the very thing that we denied ourselves at the start, right? So we have put ourselves in this corner, and it is only by understanding the cowardice in all of ourselves, the weakness and frailty in all of ourselves, that we can ever hope to begin to develop a relationship with the very tools that will allow us to get out, get up, and to expand into the world and onto it, right? So we've been living out a self-fulfilling prophecy. Our refusal to be a certain way has drawn on entities that feed off of that. When we give up space, they encroach on it. They take the space that we allow by retreating back into ourselves, right? And it is only by commanding ourselves to step forward and reclaim our space that any change will ever happen.